After a disastrous first month in office, Donald Trump's approval rating is now just 44%, a record low for this early in any presidential term. He needs a reset badly, and he'll get the chance for that just a little over an hour from now when he gives his first major speech as president. That speech will be a direct address to Congress, and according to the White House, it will mainly serve as a way for Trump to communicate his vision to the American people. You wouldn't know it from the mass deportations, Muslim bans, and saber-rattling with Iran, but sources say this vision is actually going to be an optimistic one. Trump will reportedly spend much of tonight's speech talking about the struggles of the middle class and why his administration's economic policies will make things work for everyone again. In other words, it's morning again in America. But morning for who? Working Americans or the corporations that are about to get filthy rich off Trump's disaster capitalism? Joining me now is Anthony Lowenstein, independent journalist, filmmaker, and author of Disaster Capitalist, Making a Killing Out of Catastrophe. Anthony, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
It's great having you with us. First off, let's define some terms. What is disaster capitalism? Can you give me some examples?
I can. Making money from misery in war, immigration, various other areas. I mean, I think the best examples in the last, say, decade since 9/11 would be people making money in contracting in Afghanistan or Iraq, private militaries, private militias. In immigration, for example, in the US and the UK and much of the world now, immigration centres are run for profit by private corporations. They're two good examples. The aid industry in places like Haiti, where a lot of organisations go to a place like Haiti and are making money from the aid industry, often from USAID, but actually not helping the locals themselves. So really the way it's been defined is corporations and individuals making money at the expense of locals, often in difficult countries, or indeed in Western nations as well.
Is, for example, the New Orleans post-Hurricane Katrina an example of that, where you saw massive gentrification, the displacement of large numbers of African Americans, and gentrification, I guess?
Absolutely. It's actually a great example or an awful example, depending, of course, on your perspective. And one of the interesting examples of there was to show in some ways how you could wipe the slate clean. In other words, this ideological belief that if you were able to start from scratch, you could privatise much more healthcare, privatise education, as you said, gentrify various areas, push out blacks and other minorities into areas which are less salubrious, less nice, etc. And in some ways, the architects of that are very much excited about the Trump administration. But it's important, I think, to also for viewers to know, these issues didn't suddenly become serious when Trump became president. He's going to make things a lot worse. He's going to make disaster capitalism on steroids. But ultimately, these issues have been around for 30, 40 years, progressively getting worse with every US president.
So you've been outspoken in saying that Trump is actually trying to practice this form of disaster capitalism. Normally, disaster capitalism is associated with catastrophic events like earthquake or war. So is Trump the disaster, or is our world sufficiently filled with disasters that he can merely exploit whichever ones come along?
I think it's probably the latter. I mean, look, clearly the world on a range of issues is in a pretty awful shape, from the US and beyond, the Middle East. I'm based in Jerusalem these days, and the reality there, of course, is a conflict going on for nearly 70-odd years. So the world is full of crisis. The issue about exploiting disaster is really the question of saying, how can corporations make money from that? And this is not just an issue of the biggest corporations, the DynCorp and others, the ones who often are making a huge money from contracting in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. I've spent time researching the book Disaster Capitalism and a film that I'm also working on with the same name in Afghanistan, looking at the reality on the ground about what that contracting privatization has done. And this happened during the Bush administration. It definitely did not change during Obama. In fact, on some areas, in fact, Obama worsened the outsourcing and contracting. But now we have a Trump administration who has people around him who believe deeply in this idea that the role of the state should be reduced. So when, for example, Trump talks about a $1 trillion odd infrastructure program, which he may or may not introduce in the coming months or years, he may well give people certain jobs in certain states, yes, but at the expense of what and whom? Are we talking about, for example, massively privatising roads, many more tollways, outsourcing various public services to the private sector? That's what normally this kind of process will allow, and I think a lot of the public will be opposed to that, as they are in many parts around the world.
So do you expect that Trump is going to go about forcing disaster capitalism on the U.S.? I mean, you said it's picking up, but what form will it take beyond what we already see, from private prisons to military contractors? Or is his proposal for, $50 billion increase in the military budget just a pure example of that?
Well, it's a very good example. And one example before we get to that is the immigration issue. Obviously, immigration has been an issue in the US for decades, but the Trump administration is likely to increase funding to border security and border officials who are keen to expel more people, even than Obama, who, as some viewers will remember, was the greatest deporter of immigrants for a long, long time, if not ever. So what's likely to happen is, we shouldn't forget, the day, Tom, after the US election last year in 2016, the share prices of the leading private prison and immigration facility companies soared. They were excited about what they saw was an opportunity. And what we see now is many of these companies, Geo Group, Core Civic, which used to be Corporation Correction Corporation of America, they're excited about what Trump is proposing in the immigration area, because many more people are going to be forced into immigration facilities, which means, of course, conditions are going to worsen. That's one great example of what Trump is going to bring. In the defence sector, hugely expanded funding for military infrastructure, which the US does not need. The US already has the largest military in the world by far. It already spends more than every other country in the world by far. It has bases around the world. No one knows how many US bases exist in the world. There's been a lot of studies that have suggested hundreds, maybe dozens, maybe more than that. No one actually knows. And ultimately, I think what we have to ask ourselves is, where is this added spending going? It's not simply helping the men and women in uniform, that Trump will frame it like that. It's going to go to corporations designing better weapons. And we shouldn't forget, during the Obama years, and Trump's likely to deepen that problem, he sold more weapons than many other presidents before. The US defence industry is excited about Trump, as they were with Obama. That was a supposed liberal Nobel Prize winning president. Trump is going to make that far worse.
Yeah. Back in 1944, Vice President Henry Wallace warned about the rise of people he called American fascists. He described it in a New York Times op-ed as people who claimed to be super patriots, but they would destroy every liberty guaranteed by the Constitution. They demand free enterprise, but are the spokesman for monopoly and vested interest. Their final objective, toward which all their deceit is directed, is to capture political power, so that, using the power of the state and the power of the market simultaneously, they may keep the common man in eternal subjection. Do you think that's an accurate description of Trump and his disaster capitalists as well?
I do, and I wish it wasn't so accurate. I mean, the great irony about disaster capitalism in the 21st century with Trump or others is it's socialism for the rich. The idea somehow that the military and other areas in immigration, these companies rely on state support and state funding. Immigration detention, the defence area, that's taxpayer dollars going to these industries to increase their bottom line. Salaries in many of those industries are appalling. I spent a lot of time in the last years in the immigration detention area in the US and elsewhere. Salaries are terrible, conditions are bad for guards, let alone the immigrants themselves. Food, healthcare, education is very, very poor. So that statement from the 40s, sadly, is remarkably relevant, and I think Trump doesn't even hide it. I mean, Trump has proudly talked about being a supposed expert in business, when anyone who knows anything about Trump's history will know he's a failed businessman, gone corrupt on numerous occasions, and more importantly, has surrounded himself with people who don't believe in checks and balances. And the problem is the system that he's inherited from Bush, from Obama, has almost guaranteed that problem getting worse, because those previous presidents did not put systems in place to allow contracting from the state to be accountable, whether it's war, immigration or aid. That's the problem. So Trump has inherited a perfect system for his increase in disaster capitalism.
Donald Trump and other far-right politicians like him are arguably a form of backlash to neoliberal globalization. But disaster capitalism is really just neoliberalism on steroids, is it not? I mean, isn't that a huge contradiction?
It is. Like some people have said when the book came out, well, aren't you just talking about capitalism in general? Isn't that essentially the same thing? Yes, but I guess my challenge to that would be, you can own a business, turn a profit, for example, and not treat people badly or exploit people. Disaster capitalism particularly is the extreme form of what capitalism has brought us in the 21st century. This has been going for roughly 40 years, although of course you can go back a long, long time to the East India Company back in the day, which exploited people people for profit. So this is not new. The difference is that a globalized nature in which we live and multinational corporations has allowed, as I find in my book and the film, that the same corporations often are operating in various countries. So for example, immigration detention facilities are owned by similar companies in Australia, the UK and the US. In other words, this is a multinational idea where I argue in the book, and I think this argument stands up, that the corporation in some ways has become more powerful than the state. And that's a problem when it comes to immigration. It's a problem, for example, when it comes to Silicon Valley, where anyone who knows this area will say that companies like Google, Apple, Microsoft and Facebook have arguably far more power than many states because they're often not paying tax in those states. That to me is a fundamental problem, and I think there's too few politicians in the US, Republican or certainly Democrats who will call that out. A handful will, but not many ones who are in power today.
Which raises a question in the last minute that we have here, Anthony. What should progressives do to resist Trump's disaster capitalism?
Well, I think in short, a few things. One, obviously put pressure on their politicians to not actually put these policies through. Secondly, you can work towards boycotting and targeting the companies themselves that are profiting. That could be through shareholder meetings, that could be through various other boycotts, divestment, etc. I think also it's about putting pressure on alternative groups, whether it's the Democrats, civil society and elsewhere, to say, we, and I'm not an American citizen, but we as Americans do not want this kind of environment for our people. There are countless examples from the US and elsewhere that shows the system does not work except for the few. And I like to think that the American people who voted for Trump, many of whom undeniably had good economic reasons for doing so because they were scared and pissed off, actually are probably going to realise that in fact he's not going to help their bottom line at all.
Yeah. Anthony Lowenstein, great having you with us tonight. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.